On News Extra today, we take a look at the United States of America, where President Donald Trump's second term as US president was heralded by worry over his foreign policy impact in light of some of the positions that he had held during his first term in office. A mere days after he was inaugurated, America's 47th president had threatened sanctions against neighbors Canada, Mexico, as well as trade partner China. In more recent events, President Trump had promised to impose sweeping retaliatory measures on Colombia, including tariff sanctions after the South American country turned away two U.S. military aircraft with migrants being deported as part of his administration's immigration crackdown. Now, while this situation has been averted, there are questions over what Mr. Trump's foreign policy impact will be, and that's why we are joined this morning by US-based journalist John Klopotowski. Mr. Klopotowski, thank you for joining us on News Extra.
Happy to be here as always. Thanks for having me.
So, to begin with, I wonder if you can give us a sense of, I guess, what the feeling is at home in the U.S. Regarding some of the statements and the actions that Mr. Trump has carried out within the first couple of days of being America's 47th president.
Yeah, a mix. As you said, there's a lot going on, so it depends on the issue, of course. In terms of just the sort of sense, I think at the beginning of the presidency, especially he was inaugurated a week ago, Monday, January 20th, and there was some question about how extreme he would be. He ran on an extreme agenda, and many of his critics, I think rightfully so, there's enough evidence, I think, at this point to sort of know where he stands on issues. But there was some of the people he had appointed for his cabinet, for example, seemed to be more moderate, some more extreme. So that was an open question. But definitely, within a few days, it was very clear that this was the most extreme version of a Trump presidency we could have. Within a couple of days, he signed executive orders that will be challenged in courts, but executive orders that, for example, might reverse birthright citizenship. This is unconstitutional. There's an amendment, the 14th Amendment to the United States, when the country abolished slavery. And after that, the 14th Amendment is about citizenship and establishes birthright citizenship. He wants to change that for immigrants, for example. Things like this, I think, in general, are very unpopular. The question is whether Trump supporters are really going to pay attention to it, or they're going to pay attention to things that they like to pay attention to. So there's definitely outrage in terms of the more extreme things he's done, but it still is an open question as to whether he'll be successful in a lot of these extreme things, and also how much people are really going to care.
So we'd like you to give us a sense of sentiment from the outside, right? We get a sense that U.S. citizens do pay attention to what U.S. foreign policy looks like, right? A lot happened under the Biden administration with the handling of Afghanistan, Yemen, Gaza, and under the Trump administration, in just a few days, we've seen conversations between him and the Danish Prime Minister over Greenland. We've seen his insistence on Canada becoming the 51st state, and of course these deportations to Colombia and Brazil and the reactions so far. Give us a sense of how U.S. citizens are reacting to what could be the next 4 years of U.S. foreign policy.
Well, I think it's the reaction is, I think, a little bit just sort of wondering about, like, what actually is going to happen. These are all things towards the end of his campaign. He had a meeting with the Prime Minister of Canada, who has since stepped down or announced that he will step down, Justin Trudeau, and he called him Governor Trudeau, which is governor is the term that we give to governors of states, and he made a comment about Canada being the 51st state. He said that he wanted Greenland, and the idea of Greenland is something he floated in his first term as president about buying Greenland. He apparently asked some of his aides if he could, with U.S. money, buy Greenland from Denmark. Recently, he's been talking about taking back the Panama Canal. The canal was constructed by actually the French. It started it. Eventually, Americans took over. But President Jimmy Carter in the 1970s gave the canal to Panama, and he wants to take it back. So all of these things, I think they're relatively abstract for Americans right now. We don't really know what the processes are for this. And this goes into people who would be implementing them. There's no, Denmark says in this call you referenced, the Prime Minister of Denmark told Donald Trump, Greenland is not for sale. Trump insists that people in Greenland want to be a part of the U.S. and is adamant that he will somehow make it a part of the U.S. But what the actual process for that is like, it remains an open question. Generally, in the United States, any foreign military action is unpopular, at least since, going back to the 1960s in Vietnam in general, public opinion of military actions and wars have been unpopular. But it is just sort of, I think, even amongst Trump supporters, a question about what's going to happen here and how is it going to happen.
Right. So you have mentioned Trump's supporters a couple of times, and I'm very interested in how you would define his supporters, because we have seen in some cases criticism from within the Republican Party regarding certain statements and positions that Mr. Trump has taken. How does the Republican Party differ from those who support Trump, and what sort of sentiments can you tell us from both sides of, this divide?
It's a great question, and it's one that especially the Democratic Party wants to pay attention to in terms of how they can gain power with Trump and Republicans in power, sort of how they might be able to peel off some of the Republican support is an important question for the Democrats. So they're also paying attention to it. What I would say is, for the most part, Trump has the Republican Party. He can do essentially what he wants. The best example of this is in his first week back as president, he pardoned about 1,600 people who had been convicted of crimes related to January 6th, the insurrection that happened after he falsely claimed that he had won the 2020 election. He incited a mob to go invade the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and somehow prevent the process taking place of bringing Joe Biden into the country. So these people, some of them acted violently towards police officers. Some police officers died that day or died later from related injuries. And throughout the campaign, he kind of hinted that he might pardon these people who have been convicted and put in prison and sentenced. But that was a very unpopular thing. And a lot of Republicans at the time were not in favor of it. And definitely, even J.D. Vance, his vice president, when they were campaigning, Vance was asked by journalists whether he would be in favor of pardoning these January 6th rioters. And J.D. Vance's answer was, I'm not in favor of pardoning people who've been convicted of violent crimes. Very straightforward. But now, all of those people have been pardoned. He came into office and he did that. The president has the ability to pardon people convicted of federal crimes. And since Washington, D.C. is the country's capital, it's a federal city, and so he has jurisdiction. And mostly Republicans haven't said anything. They've been asked by journalists. Their answers are usually either there is a miscarriage of justice and this is a good thing, or sometimes they say, which is hardly believable to me, that they haven't seen the full details. So I think this is a really good example right now about how much Republicans are going to push back against Donald Trump. It seems like right now the answer is very, very little, which is not a good indication that they will, on some other issue, push back even more. So that's how it is now. In terms of wanting Greenland, wanting to get the Panama Canal back, everything happening with the Colombian president and Donald Trump. Usually in terms of foreign policy, the president really sets the sort of directive there. So I would be surprised if there's real pushback from within the Republican Party about that.
So let's talk about what pushback or reactions could look like internationally. Under the Biden administration, with the treatment of Gaza and the relationship with Israel, a number of countries accused the U.S. of double standards. And a Trump administration that keeps insisting on an America First policy, to the point of not really being considerate of what international law says about certain things. So again, I'm bringing back the conversation around trying to claim Greenland, the contentions with Canada. We've also seen that one of his closest advisors, Elon Musk, is essentially on a collision course with leaders of European countries, especially Western Europe. So all of these things come up and raise the question of whether there are concerns that the U.S. will begin to, or will further be seen as, I don't know if a pariah state is the way to describe it, because the US still has global influence, but a pariah state, or at the very least, unethical and really not interested in a rules-based system that it's been touting for years now.
I think that's exactly right. You mentioned Gaza, and that's a really interesting case. Partly because, as you say, the United States, at least after the establishment, the government realized that, for example, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan were really unpopular. And there was a clear discrepancy between what the U.S. was touting in terms of what they want to see from other countries and what the U.S. military was doing in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. At least among people like Joe Biden, there was some sort of reckoning with this. And, for example, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, although it wasn't smooth by any means, Biden was adamant that he wanted to do this. And that was sort of a signal to the rest of the world that perhaps the U.S. has evolved, or at least paying more attention to its actions around the world. Now, as you say, that's the same president that allowed all of these things to continue going on in Gaza. Eventually he did, in terms of Gaza, the U.S. supplied bombs to the Israeli army, 2,000-pound bombs. Eventually, that was one thing that Biden stopped giving to Israel. Trump has continued to give them to Israel now. He agreed to let those weapons carry on to Israel. So, yes, it's another sort of open question. I mean, I laugh not because any of these things are light, but just because he ran on these things, and a lot of people, at least in the U.S., tend not to really take him seriously about these things. And it's funny to me, in a sense, because, I mean, it's a funny, not so funny type of situation, because he's done a lot of the things that he's said he's going to do in the past. And there's always, with Donald Trump, this tendency, especially amongst his supporters, to say, like, to opponents, don't take Trump seriously, he's telling a joke, or he was exaggerating here, or, whatever sort of justification for something he might say that sounds pretty outlandish or improbable. But for the most part, he tries to follow through. Whether or not he's successful is not always 100% in his control, but we heard today that a ceasefire deal was announced right as the inauguration was, or it came in to place, a ceasefire in Gaza right as Trump was taking office, and he took credit for that, and I think his team was a part of the negotiations. But just today, it was reported that he said he wants to clear Gaza, and he asked Egypt and he asked Jordan to take more Palestinian refugees so that Gaza could be empty, because he wanted, quote, a clean slate. A clean slate sounds like ethnic cleansing to a lot of people here in the U.S. This was not something that he really ran on, but I think at this point we have to take him at his word that he's going to try to do things like this. So, again, like I said, whether or not he's successful about these things remains an open question for him, even because there are other forces involved. But it is frightening. And last point I'd make is that you mentioned Elon Musk. He was in Germany today or yesterday, speaking in front of the AfD, the far right party in Germany, the Alles für Deutschland party, and I think he made a statement about how young Germans shouldn't feel badly about the sins their ancestors committed. I think speaking about the Holocaust. This is a man who made a gesture that looked a lot like a Sieg Heil gesture during the inauguration. And he also donated $250 million to the Trump campaign. And now he has an office in the White House. And so the second Trump administration, who's closer to Donald Trump, Elon Musk wasn't there the first time. There were maybe people who were more familiar with how government works and might try to restrain Trump, but it seems like that's really different this time.
Well, it's definitely something to keep an eye on, Mr. Klopotowski. And as you've pointed out, we will be watching the U.S., as will almost everyone in the world, over the course of the next 4 years. But thank you so much for speaking with us, and thank you for the expertise that you have brought, the insight you've brought to the conversations on News Extra.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me again.
Our pleasure. Lagos, Nigeria. John Klopotowski is a U.S.-based journalist who joined us to speak on U.S. President Donald Trump's foreign policy impact. Donald Trump has been quite vocal on migrant deportations, as well as his attempts to claim Greenland as a U.S. territory. Now, these are positions that have raised concerns about what the next 4 years could mean for U.S. foreign policy. That's News Extra on Radio Now 95.3 FM Lagos. We urge you to stay tuned to your Beyond the News station. In a few short moments, we'll be bringing you a look at the front pages of our dailies on the News Review. Good morning.